The pilots of an Air Canada Boeing 767 find themselves in a desperate fight for survival. High above the Canadian wilderness, their massive jet has run out of fuel, and now they are running out of time. Will they be able to make it back to safety? Or will they and their 61 passengers meet their bitter end in the coming minutes? This is the incredible story of Air Canada, Flight 143. Thank you. On the afternoon of July 23, 1983, 61 passengers and 8 crew boarded an Air Canada Boeing 767 at Montreal. They were bound for Edmonton, all the way over in the west of the country, with a brief stopover in Ottawa. Nobody knew it yet, but they were all about to become part of one of the most infamous events in the history of aviation. Many accounts of this incident focus on one particular mistake, but what most people don't know is that the story of Flight 143 involves a whole chain of unlikely and incredibly unfortunate events. This chain of errors would reveal critical flaws in Canada's aviation industry, which had implications for the entire world. That summer afternoon, Captain Robert Pearson arrived at Montreal Airport to take 61 passengers to Edmonton. I'm one of Air Canada's brand new aircraft, a Boeing 767 at 48 years of age. He was a highly experienced pilot with just over 15,000 hours of flying time. He had flown a wide variety of aircraft for Air Canada, and in his spare time he also flew gliders. In many ways, his whole life was a preparation for the events of this day. Although he was to have no idea about this as he pulled up at the airport for what seemed like a completely routine flight when Pearson arrived at the airport car park. That day he bumped into the pilots who had just flown the plane into Montreal, who were on the way home from the airport. The pilots said their hellos, and the outgoing crew explained that the new plane was in perfect working order. Apart from one small issue, there was a problem with the fuel gauges. Because of this problem, the fuel quantity in the plane's tanks needed to be checked manually, using what's known as a drip test. This involves pulling out a stick from the underside of each fuel tank, which indicates the depth of the fuel in centimeters. It may sound rudimentary, but it was a pretty reliable way of checking the amount of fuel on board. Captain Pearson was joined on this day by 36-year-old First Officer Maurice Quintal, was also very experienced, having logged over 7,000 hours total flying time before joining Air Canada. He had served in the Canadian Air Force. This experience in the Air Force would end up being vitally important on this flight, but for reasons you would never expect, the aircraft they were flying was a brand new Boeing 767. The 767 was Boeing's latest aircraft at the time, having just entered service less than a year previously. It was a marvel of engineering with small television screens, taking the place of many of the round dials found in older aircraft. Importantly, it was also the first Boeing wide-body plane to have just 2 flight crew members, having automated away the position of flight engineer. This apparent advancement would be met with serious scrutiny as a direct result of the events which would unfold on this day in the Boeing 767. The fuel quantity gauges are located on the overhead panel sensors in the fuel tanks. Tell them how much fuel there is on board for redundancy. There are 2 channels which feed the gauges. This information channel 1 and channel 2. If one channel fails, the other channel is able to display the fuel quantity by itself. However, if there is just one channel working, as there was on this plane, the plane's fuel must also be checked manually, just to make sure that the readings from that remaining channel are accurate. While the pilots had been chatting in the car park, a ground engineer was in the cockpit, troubleshooting the faulty gauges. The previous engineer at the plane's last stopover had found the displays blank, and to solve this, he had pulled the circuit breaker for channel 2. This meant that just channel 1 was feeding data to the gauge, and it started working. Now this ground engineer at Montreal wanted to see if he could get the system. Until very recently, when Air Canada acquired its 767s. In fact, these were the only planes in the fleet which used kilograms. So when the captain asked him for the conversion factor, he gave the figure used to convert liters into pounds, not kilograms. Because 1 kilogram is about the same as 2 pounds. The pilots were now taking on less than half the fuel they needed for the trip to Edmonton, and with the fuel gauges blank, there was no way for them to notice their mistake. The funeral began. filling up the plane's wing tanks, and by the time he was finished, the plane had just 10,000 kilograms of the 22,000 needed to reach Edmonton. The pilots, blissfully unaware of their mistakes, were now about to hurl themselves skywards, along with 67 passengers and crew on a doomed mission to Edmonton. This episode is sponsored by War Thunder. War Thunder is the most comprehensive online vehicle combat game ever made, with more than 2,000 vehicles, including planes, helicopters, tanks, and ships. I really like how detailed the vehicles are. They're modeled down to their individual components, each of which can be damaged in battle. I've also enjoyed how much interaction there is between all the vehicles in the game. If you like flying the planes like I do, you'll get shot at by other players playing as ships at sea and tanks on the ground. So it's a really active world. The 4K graphics are great, and the authentic sound effects really give the game an immersive atmosphere. It's free to play on PC, Xbox Series X and S, PlayStation 5, and the previous console generation. Click my link in the description to play War Thunder for free on PC, PlayStation, or Xbox. You get a large free bonus pack by signing up with my link, which includes multiple premium vehicles, a premium account, boosters, and much more. Once the passengers had boarded and the cargo was loaded, the aircraft pushed back from the gate at Montreal. First, the pilots would make a short hop to Ottawa, 30 minutes away, before continuing their journey to Edmonton at 10 minutes to 6 that evening. Captain Pearson pushed the 767's massive engines to take off thrust, and the plane began speeding down the runway. The departure from Montreal was routine. There was no indication to the pilots or the passengers that anything was amiss, but in the aircraft's fuel tanks, disaster awaited. With every minute that passed, the fuel level got lower and lower. Music, shortly after leaving Montreal. Flight 143 arrived in Ottawa. Captain Pearson taxied the jet to the gate, and some passengers got off, while others hopped on band for Edmonton just to make assurance doubly sure. The pilots wanted to check again that they had enough fuel for the flight to Edmonton. After all, they knew that the minimum equipment list dictated that they shouldn't be flying without functioning fuel quantity indicators. Captain Pearson ordered the refuelers to carry out the drip check on both wings. When they did this, they found that there were 430 liters of fuel in the plane's wing tanks again. The captain and first officer multiplied this figure by 1.78, which was the false conversion ratio they had used in Montreal. This gave them 2,400 kilograms, more than enough to reach Edmonton. However, in reality, the 11,000 liters should have been multiplied by 0.8, which would have given them the real figure of just over 9,000 kilograms, barely half of what they needed. Music. But because the pilots had been consistent in their use of the wrong conversion factor, all of the numbers checked out perfectly. Within a few minutes, the new passenger supported, and the flight panning was completed. From this point, there will be no further opportunities for the pilots to spot their mistake when they started the engines again. The clock started ticking. Music. Late that afternoon, Flight 143 took to the EU skies without functioning fuel gauges, and with just half the required fuel in its tanks. Music. For the first hour or so, everything was routine asphalt. 143 cruised high above the Canadian countryside. The meal service went through the cabin, and the pilots discussed the new aircraft and its systems. Another Air Canada pilot who was flying as a passenger had joined the flight crew in the cockpit. He was a pilot on the Boeing 727, a much older aircraft released in the 1960s. To him, the 767 was a substantial leap forward, and he was excited to get a look at how the aircraft operated. The plane was flying at 41,000 feet, which was higher than most passenger aircraft could fly at the time. Thankfully, given the storm clouds they encountered along their route, it was also higher than most of the weather. Nonetheless, the pilots gave the storms a respectful berth, not realizing that something far more troubling was brewing on the aircraft itself. Just as the crew were finishing their meals, they were interrupted by a beeping noise in the cockpit, followed by a strange warning on the E-case, or engine indicating and crew alerting system. It warned them that the fuel pump in the left wing tank was running at low pressure. This was unusual. How could there be a problem with a fuel pump in such a new aircraft? The pilots checked the overhead panel and saw that the low-pressure light was illuminated there as well. First Officer Quintal began thumbing through the 767's pilot handbook to see if he could figure out what could be causing the problem. Meanwhile, the captain figured that the low-pressure indication was probably a result of the fuel pump itself having failed. As such, he switched off the fuel pump. The pilots also discussed the possibility that they were low on fuel, but dismissed it as unlikely they had checked the fuel. At Ottawa, and also the aircraft's onboard computer known as the Flight Management System, or FMC, indicated that they had more than enough fuel to reach Edmonton, and it had been saying that at each point that they had checked the fuel since taking off from Ottawa. But the FMC's fuel predictions were only as good as the data which had been fed into it. And unbeknownst to the pilots, the fuel quantity data they had put in was horribly wrong. The fuel figures it was showing them were based off of the false figures that they had entered at the start of the flight. Then, while the pilots were still trying to figure out what the problem was, another light been done now. Both left-wing fuel pumps were showing a low-pressure warning. This was an ominous sign. The pilots knew that it was extremely unlikely that both fuel pumps had failed independently. There had to be a common cause, and whatever it was, it couldn't be good. Immediately, the pilots decided that they had better divert. They radioed air traffic control and requested an immediate diversion to Winnipeg, which was their nearest major airport. Captain Pearson began turning towards Winnipeg and started descending. As the pilots troubleshooted the problem, the controller asked if they wanted to fire an ambulance services to meet them on the runway. The captain said that for the moment they wouldn't be needed. He was not to know that, in a few moments, not even the emergency services could help him moments later. The rest of the fuel pump pressure lights illuminated for the right-wing fuel tanks. Now every pump was showing low pressure. The flight crew were second. The center of the overhead panel was now lit up like a Christmas tree. The captains summoned the chief flight attendant to the cockpit and appraised him of the situation. But just as he did this, the unthinkable happened. The left-hand engine ran out of fuel and flamed out alarms, sounded as the engine rolled back and the autopilot disconnected. The crew's situation was now serious. What had started out looking like a small technical problem was now a full-blown emergency. The first officer pulled out the checklist for a single engine approach in landing, and the captain advised the controller at Winnipeg that he would be needing the emergency services. After all, the crew still didn't know what was wrong at this point. Whatever it was serious enough to have disabled one engine, but could it get worse? Less than 2 minutes. Later they got their answer when the right-hand engine flamed out. Both, said the captain. The pilots were stunned without engine power. Their instrumentation had gone completely blank. Their state-of-the-art jet carrying 67 passengers and crew had now become nothing more than a gigantic glider. The comforting hum of the plane's 2 engines had been replaced by an eerie silence as the aircraft drifted steadily towards the terrain below. Despite their shock, the pilots had to act fast. They needed to pick out a place to put the plane down, and at their current altitude of 28,000 feet and descending. They didn't have much time in an aircraft like the 767. The engines don't just provide thrust to move the plane forwards, they also supplied with electrical and hydraulic power. Now that the engines had stopped, the hydraulically boosted control surfaces on the wings and tail became incredibly heavy to control the plane's descent. The captain had to pull the control surfaces against a massive air moving at hundreds of kilometers per hour, with nothing more than the strength of his own arms. But the 767 was hiding a trick up its sleeve. Within moments, the ram air turbine deployed from underneath the aircraft. This is a small fan which spins in the wind, generating a small amount of electricity to run the aircraft's most critical systems. This returned power to the pilot's most important instruments, and crucially, it also restored some hydraulic power to the two flight controls. The controls were still heavy, but at least they could now be moved a bit more easily. Captain Pearson declared an emergency to air traffic control and informed the controller that the aircraft had lost both of its engines. The controller cleared the aircraft directly to Winnipeg, where the pilots hoped they would be able to set the crippled aircraft down as Pearson began gliding the aircraft. First Officer Quintal began routing through the manuals for procedures which dealt with the loss of both engines. Put his horror, there were none. Boeing had simply never envisaged a scenario where a flight crew would have to glide one of their 767s. Pearson and Quintal had now become test pilots, but it was not just their lives at stake. Behind them, the lives of 67 passengers and crew depended entirely on the decisions they would make in the coming minutes. The captain was eager to stretch the glide as far as possible. This way he could keep his options open in terms of where he could set the plane down as a glider pilot. He knew that to get as far as possible, he needed to glide the plane at its optimal speed, the speed which ensured the least loss of altitude per kilometer traveled. But there was a problem. Boeing had not published this speed in any of the manuals as a double-engine failure, just wasn't a contingency. They had thought about Pearson simply had to make an educated guess as to the optimum glide speed and hope for the best. He figured that in a 767 this speed would be about 220 knots or 400 kilometers per hour. And without engines, the only way he could control the speed of the plane was by manipulating the pitch attitude of the aircraft, push the nose down, and he would gain speed. Pull it back, and he would lose speed. His full attention now switched to maintaining 220 knots in order to stretch the plane's glide as far as possible. Music. Now that they were established in the glide, the pilots faced a crucial question: would they be able to make it to Winnipeg? Pearson was doing everything he could to stretch the glide, but would that be enough? Quintal needed to figure out how far they would be able to glide given their current altitude. Normally, an instrument in the cockpit known as the vertical speed indicator, or VSI, would tell the pilots how fast they were descending. But without engines, this instrument had stopped working. As a result, Quintal had to do the calculations by hand. His calculations were critically important. If he made a mistake, it could mean the difference between life and death. For everyone on board, the pilots were desperately hoping that Winnipeg was in range back in the passenger cabin. The chief flight attendant tried to keep his cool as he told the passengers about the plane's dire situation. The other flight attendants directed some passengers towards the rows beside the emergency doors and instructed them on how to open them. However, they knew very well that it was unlikely that these instructions would even be necessary. In all likelihood, the loss of both engines was a death sentence for everyone on board, but up front in the cockpit, the pilots were hard at work doing everything they could to put the odds in their favor to calculate how fast the plane was descending. The first officer took readings from the plane's altimeter, which told him his altitude, and plotted them against the air traffic controller's reports of the plane's distance from Winnipeg. He did this at regular intervals in order to work out the plane's rate of descent, and therefore its range. When he did these calculations, what he found was terrifying. Over the previous 10 miles, the plane had dropped 5,000 feet. That meant that it was descending at a rate of almost 2,500 feet per minute. At that descent rate, it would hit the earth in less than 10 minutes. There was no denying it. They would not make it to Winnipeg. Their best shot was now gone. But there was no time to dwell on this. Captain Pearson immediately began turning the plane north, towards his only other option. That option was Gimli, an decommissioned military air base beside Lake Winnipeg. Coincidentally, the first officer had been stationed there. During his time in the Canadian Air Force, his familiarity with the area would be tremendously useful as the crew made their descent. However, a terrifying surprise laid in wait for the pilots. Gimli had changed a lot since Quintal had been stationed there. In fact, it was now a public airport, and what's more, one of their own ways had been converted into a racetrack. And today, Saturday, was family race day. As the pilots lined their massive aircraft up with the runway at Gimli, racers sped up and down it, cheered on by their families and friends on the sidelines. They had no idea, as they barbecued their dinners in the evening sun, that a massive passenger jet was now heading straight for them, in complete silence. The pilots, too, were clueless about the existence of the racers. They were too far from the runway at this point to see them. The captain was laser-focused on getting his flying brick of an aircraft onto the runway without engines. There will be no second chances. He had one shot at landing this aircraft, but as if the engine is landing didn't already pose enough challenges. Some additional problems began to rear their heads as the plane neared Gimli. The ram air turbine, that fan that had dropped from the fuselage to supply power, wasn't able to provide enough hydraulic power to lower the plane's flaps. Flaps are an essential part of any landing. They allow the aircraft to fly at slower speeds, without stalling. Without flaps, Pearson would have to fly the aircraft at a much higher speed in order to prevent it from stalling and falling out of the sky, rather than the usual 149 approach speed. He would have to fly this approach at least 180 knots, or about 330 kilometers per hour. Then the pilots encountered their next problem when First Officer Quintal lowered the landing gear lever. The three lights which signified their successful deployment never illuminated. There simply wasn't enough hydraulic power to lower the gear. The aircraft was nearing the ground, and in less than a minute, it would hit. However bad the outcome of this was already looking. It would be worse if the plane's body itself had to take the brunt of the impact forces. Pearson told Quintal to use the emergency gravity gear extension switch. This switch released the door gear pins, allowing the gear to extend slowly under their own weight. The first officer watched anxiously, waiting for the indicator lights to show that the gear had dropped after a nail-biting weight. The left and right main gear locked into place, but worryingly the nose gear didn't. Without a nose gear, the nose of the aircraft would end up scraping along the ground after touchdown, making it nearly impossible to steer the plane left and right and putting tremendous strain on the aircraft's structure, given how fast the plane was coming in. The pilots didn't know whether the aircraft could take the strain. There was a very real chance that it would break apart on impact, dashing the odds of survival. For the passengers and crew, Captain Pearson now had in his hands an aircraft which was more crippled than any he had handled in his entire career. He had no engines, no flaps, no nose gear, and as he slowed the plane for landing, the ram air turbine was no longer able to produce as much hydraulic pressure, which made the flight controls even harder to operate, just as he knew the runway, when he needed the most control he could get. Pearson's control column was becoming increasingly heavy and difficult to manipulate, but as the massive aircraft got closer to the runway, a new problem emerged. The pilots, eager to conserve altitude during the glide, had ended up too high on approach. They were now well above where they needed to be, and they had to get down. If they simply dove towards the runway, they would gain too much speed and would end up going off the end of it. On landing somehow, Pearson and Quintal needed to figure out a way to lose altitude without gaining too much airspeed under normal circumstances. If they found themselves too high, the pilots would be able to use the speed brakes. Speed brakes are flaps that pop up from the wings to slow the plane down and allow it to descend without getting too fast, but without hydraulic power, the speed brakes weren't working. The pilots needed another solution. They considered doing a 360-degree turn to put more space between their plane and the runway. However, Pearson realized that while they were too high to simply dive towards the runway, they were too low to make a full 360. If they attempted it, they would run into the ground before making it back to the runway. It appeared that the pilots were now out of options, but Captain Pearson had one more trick left up his sleeve. As a glider pilot, he had learned a technique known as a forward slip. The forward slip is a delicate maneuver used to lose altitude quickly, without gaining too much airspeed. It involves rolling the plane to one side so that it slips downwards while pushing the rudder in the opposite direction, so that the plane stays on course. This is known as crossing the controls, and while it's often used in gliders, it's simply not done in passenger aircraft. But on this day, Pearson had no choice. He banked his Boeing 767 higher to the left and stomped on the right rotor, crossing the controls in a last-ditch effort to lose altitude in time to make the runway. The gut-wrenching maneuver terrified the passengers, with those on the left-hand side of the plane looking straight down into the fields. Below, the aircraft groaned and shook as it was buffeted by the wind hitting its side. Quintal held on tight as the captain wrestled the plane down more than just being violent. This forward slip had a dangerous side effect. With the air no longer hitting the ram air turbine dead on, it began spinning slower and producing even less hydraulic power. Pearson had really put himself in a bind here. His flight controls were now heavier and less responsive than they had ever been. Would he even be able to straighten up his aircraft in time for touchdown, or would he crash sideways into the runway? spilling people and aircraft parts out onto the tarmac, while Pearson grappled with his aircraft. Quintal caught sight of something that stopped, his heart straight ahead of him on the runway. Were hordes of people and cars. Now it was not just the lives of people on the plane who were at risk, but hundreds on the ground as well. Quintal decided not to tell the captain about what he was seeing. They were out of options at this point. The runway was the only place they could put the plane down safely, and even that was in doubt. Pearson's full attention needed to be on flying the aircraft. In the final seconds, the captain heaved the massive aircraft back to straight and level. The jet smacked down on the runway and Pearson violently slammed on the brakes, now catching sight of two terrified boys on bikes ahead of him, trying to outpedal the speeding jetliner. The plane's main tires burst, sending a loud shockwave through the aircraft as the nose slammed down onto the guardrail, which ran down the middle of the runway. A fire broke out in the nose from the sheer force of friction between it and the guardrail. But finally, after skidding for 3,000 feet down the tarmac, the massive jet came to a stop. Incredibly, nobody was hurt. Racers sped to the aircraft to help extinguish the fire which had started under the nose and to aid in the passenger evacuation. As more came rushing in with fire extinguishers, they met the captain on his way out of the aircraft, who, seeing their extinguishers, said, "Don't worry, we're out of gas." Pearson and Quintal had just pulled off the impossible. They had glided a passenger jet nearly 100 kilometers from cruising altitude and landed it without injuring a single passenger. This was the longest glide in the history of commercial aviation until August of 2001, when another Canadian crew encountered a similar situation halfway across the Atlantic Ocean. I've covered that incident here on the channel as well, so check it out at the top right of your screen as a result of the investigation which followed. This incident, Air Canada standardized the fuel weight units across its fleet. They also introduced circuit breaker inoperative tags that would prevent the breaker from being reset, and they improved their fueling procedures to prevent similar misunderstandings from happening again. Importantly, they also established a flight safety organization within the airline, whose job it was to identify areas of weakness and improve procedures. Accordingly, Captain Pearson was hailed as a hero in the media, but for his role in the incident, he was demoted for 6 months by Air Canada, while the first officer was suspended for 2 weeks. Both pilots went on to have successful careers after this, however, and because of the changes made as a result of this incident, the skies in which they flew were significantly safer. Thanks again to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Click my link in the description box to play War Thunder for free on PC, PlayStation, or Xbox. There's a free bonus for using this link, which includes multiple premium vehicles, a premium account, boosters, and much more. And I should also mention that you don't need any special hardware to play. A mouse and a keyboard is all you need. And special thanks to the Patreon and YouTube members for helping to make this video possible. If you'd like to see more of these videos, it would really help if you could support the channel on Patreon. I've put the link here on screen. I'd especially like to thank Joey, Steve Wilcox, JB Funk, and Simon Burbage for their very generous support. Green Dot Aviation now has a Discord server, so if you'd like to join a growing community of people discussing all things aviation, just tap the link in the video description, and I'll see you there. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you soon for the next episode.